Let me ask you a strange question. What if one of the most famous films ever made wasn't fiction? What if it was a reconstruction? In 1999, Stanley Kubrick finished his final movie, Eyes Wide Shut, a film about powerful people attending a secret masked ritual. Most viewers assumed it was symbolism, a metaphor, a strange psychological fantasy. But according to several people who worked on the film, Kubrick wasn't inventing that ritual, he was recreating it. During production, he reportedly collected photographs, recordings, reference material he kept locked away from almost everyone on set. Then, something even stranger happened. Kubrick screened a longer version of the film privately, a version that has never been released. People who were in that room say the ritual scene ended differently. The masks came off. The camera didn't cut away. And for a few seconds, the audience could see the faces behind them.
Guide us.
6 days later, Kubrick was dead. When the film reached theaters months later, those moments were gone. Which leaves one unsettling question. If Stanley Kubrick really showed something in that screening, what exactly did he discover while making Eyes Wide Shut? Because the deeper you look into the story of this film, the stranger it becomes. March 1st, 1999. Stanley Kubrick delivers the final cut of his last film to the studio. 6 days later, he is dead. Officially, a heart attack. But that isn't the part that stayed with me. The part that stayed with me is what I saw before he died. I worked as a projectionist in a private screening room outside London. Quiet job. Mostly studio previews, rough cuts, technical checks. Nothing unusual. Until the night Stanley Kubrick came in with a film canister marked only with a production code, Eyes Wide Shut. But the version inside that can was not the one the world would later see. It was longer, much longer, almost 4 hours. At the time, that didn't seem strange. Kubrick was famous for endless edits and impossible standards. But the atmosphere that night was different. No studio executives, no press, just Kubrick, a small group of assistants, and me in the projection booth. And before the film even started, something already felt wrong. Kubrick walked the entire room himself, checking doors, checking windows, even looking behind the curtains near the back wall, as if he expected someone to be watching. At the time, it looked like the behavior of a perfectionist director. Later, I realized it looked more like someone being careful, someone who knew what he was about to show. The lights dimmed, the projector started, and for the first hour, the film looked familiar. Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman, a wealthy New York world hiding strange desires beneath perfect lives. But then, the film started drifting into something else. Scenes that never appeared in the theatrical release. Longer conversations. Strange symbols placed deliberately in the background. And then came the mansion sequence. The masked ceremony. The scene everyone remembers. Except the version I saw was different. Much longer. And much more precise. Kubrick didn't watch the screen the way most directors do. He wasn't studying performances. He was watching the audience, watching their reactions, watching their faces, almost like he was measuring how much they understood. And when the ritual scene began, something changed in the room. The chanting, the masks, the slow, deliberate movements. None of it felt like typical movie staging. Even from the projection booth, I remember thinking the choreography looked too exact, too rehearsed, like the actors weren't guessing what to do, like they already knew. At the time, it felt like brilliant filmmaking. Years later, I started hearing stories from people who worked on that scene, and they said something strange. Some of the extras didn't need rehearsal. They arrived already knowing the ritual. The ceremony continued for nearly 20 minutes, far longer than the version released in theaters. The camera moved slowly across rows of masked figures, dozens of them, standing in silence. And Kubrick held the shot longer than any normal film would, long enough to notice something unsettling. Some of the faces behind those masks didn't look like actors. They looked like people who were used to being there, comfortable, familiar with the ritual. And then the film showed something I've never seen again in any version. The ceremony ending, the masks coming off. I remember leaning closer to the projection window, because for just a moment, the camera showed their faces, real faces, not actors, not characters, just people standing in that room. And Kubrick didn't cut away. He let the camera stay there, as if the audience was supposed to recognize them. The screening ended close to midnight. Nobody spoke when the lights came on. Kubrick simply nodded once and asked for the film reels to be returned to him. 6 days later, he was dead. And when the film was released months later, the version I had projected that night no longer existed. Not the same scenes, not the same footage, and definitely not the same ending. But the strangest part? Years later, I started hearing rumors about what Kubrick had been researching while making the film. And suddenly, that 4-hour cut started to make a lot more sense. When people talk about Eyes Wide Shut, they usually mention the masks, the ritual, the mansion, the strange atmosphere. But very few people ask a more important question. Where did Stanley Kubrick get the details? Because according to several people who worked with him, those details didn't come from fiction. During production in 1996, Kubrick became unusually secretive. And that says a lot, considering he was already known as one of the most private directors in Hollywood. But this time, it was different. Studio executives weren't allowed to see daily footage. Crew members signed unusually strict confidentiality agreements, and the production schedule stretched far beyond what anyone expected. The shoot would eventually last over 400 days. At first, the studio assumed the usual explanation. Kubrick was a perfectionist. He always took longer than planned, but some people close to the production believed something else was happening. Kubrick wasn't just directing a film, he was researching something. At the time, no one understood what that research was about. Years later, fragments started to appear. Notes, interviews, private journals, and they all pointed to the same unsettling idea. Kubrick believed the rituals in the story might actually exist. The film was based on a 1926 novella called Traumnovelle, a strange story about secret societies and masked ceremonies among wealthy elites. Kubrick had been obsessed with the book for decades, but during the filming of Eyes Wide Shut, that obsession changed. According to production designer Roy Walker, Kubrick showed him something disturbing. Photographs. Real photographs. Walker wrote about it in a private journal entry dated April 3, 1996. Kubrick claimed the images showed ceremonies almost identical to the ones described in the novel. The same masks, the same robes, the same ritual arrangement. Kubrick allegedly told Walker something chilling. He wasn't adapting fiction. He was documenting something real. At the time, that sounded like an eccentric director chasing inspiration. But then, the behavior on set started changing, and people began to notice. Kubrick installed additional security systems in his home. He avoided phone calls. Sometimes he communicated with crew members only through handwritten notes, notes that were destroyed immediately after being read. On set, He kept a locked safe containing reference materials. No one else was allowed to see what was inside, not even senior crew. But everyone knew those materials existed, because Kubrick constantly referred to them when staging certain scenes, especially one, the ritual. The masked ceremony sequence became the centerpiece of the entire production. Costume designers were given extremely specific instructions. The masks, the robes, even the colors of the candles. Everything had to match Kubrick's reference materials exactly. One designer reportedly asked where the designs came from. Kubrick's response was brief: "From people who would rather I didn't have them." No one pressed further, but the tension on set began to grow, because something about the ritual scene didn't feel like normal filmmaking. Some extras were hired through unusual channels. Their names never appeared in standard production records. And according to an assistant director, those extras didn't need to learn the choreography. They already knew it. When rehearsals began, most actors needed instructions: where to stand, when to move, how to perform the ceremony. But a small group of masked participants never asked questions. They moved naturally, almost automatically, like they had performed the ritual before. And Kubrick didn't correct them. He simply watched, carefully, as if they were confirming something he already suspected. By 1998, Kubrick had assembled a rough cut of the film, nearly 4 hours long. Only a handful of people would ever see it, including the projectionist running the screening. That night, I believed I was watching a film still being edited. But looking back now, I'm not so sure. Because during that screening, Kubrick wasn't behaving like a director showing unfinished work. He looked like a man who had finally finished a warning. And only 6 days after delivering the final version of the film, Stanley Kubrick was dead. But the story didn't end there. Because after his death, the film I had projected began to change. After Stanley Kubrick died, something strange happened to the film. Not rumors, not speculation, actual changes, scenes removed, images altered. And according to people who worked on the final release, those edits were made very quickly, almost as if someone was in a hurry. I didn't hear about Kubrick's death from the news. I heard it from someone at the studio. A short phone call, 3 sentences. Kubrick passed away this morning. Heart attack. The film is locked. Locked. That word stayed in my mind, because the version I had projected days earlier didn't look finished. And yet suddenly, it was. At first, nothing seemed unusual. A director dies. The studio finishes the film. That happens sometimes. But what happened next was different. Within 48 hours of Kubrick's death, post-production resumed. Digital artists were brought in. Editors were called back. And the most controversial sequence in the film, the ritual inside the mansion, was modified. Officially, the explanation was simple. The studio needed to avoid an adult-only rating, so they added computer-generated figures to obscure certain parts of the scene. That was the public explanation. But people who worked on the edits later described something else. The instructions were oddly specific. They weren't just hiding bodies. They were hiding faces. Certain wide shots were removed. Background figures were covered. Symbols on walls disappeared between cuts. The camera angles were changed. Not drastically, just enough that you couldn't study the room the way Kubrick originally filmed it. Editors described the process as surgical, frame by frame, small details quietly erased. And the more I heard about these edits, the more one memory kept returning. Because in the version I projected, Kubrick did something unusual during the ritual sequence. He slowed everything down. The camera moved deliberately across the crowd, almost like a documentary, almost like he wanted the audience to see who was there. At the time, I thought it was simply Kubrick's style. Now I wonder if it was something else. Maybe he wasn't filming actors. Maybe he was filming evidence. Months after the film was released, I watched the theatrical version. Curiosity. Nothing more. But within minutes, I realized something was wrong. The pacing was different. Certain shots were missing, and the ritual, the moment I remembered most clearly, had been shortened. The masks stayed on. The camera cut away earlier, and the ending of the ceremony was completely gone. But the strangest difference wasn't what was removed. It was what was added. Digital silhouettes, computer-generated figures placed in the foreground, standing in positions that blocked the background, blocking the exact places where I remembered seeing faces. Real faces. And suddenly, the explanation about film ratings didn't make sense anymore. Because the added figures weren't covering anything explicit. They were covering people. Years later, someone who worked on those digital alterations spoke anonymously in a trade publication. They said the studio gave them a list, specific frames, specific individuals in the background. Those faces had to disappear. Not blur, not darken, disappear. For a long time, I tried to convince myself it meant nothing. Studios edit films all the time. Scenes get cut. Details change. But then, something happened that made the whole story darker. Because people who had worked on that ritual scene started dying. Editors, crew members, assistants, all connected to the same sequence. 7 of them over the next few years. Individually, each death looked ordinary, but together, the pattern started to look different. And then one night, in 2005, someone on an internet forum claimed they had seen the same version of the film that I had, the 4-hour version, the one that was never released. For 3 days, that person described scenes that only a few of us had ever seen. And on the 4th day, their final message appeared online. Just one sentence. They found me. The account disappeared within hours. Posts deleted. Profile gone. At the time, most people dismissed it as internet drama. Forums in the early 2000s were full of people claiming secret knowledge. But something about those descriptions felt different, because the scenes they described were extremely specific. The longer ritual, the camera lingering on masked figures, and the moment when the ceremony ended, and the masks were removed. That detail caught my attention immediately, because very few people should have known about that part. At first, it looked like coincidence, but then others began discussing the same film, frame by frame. After the home video release of Eyes Wide Shut, viewers could finally pause the film, rewind, zoom in on details that passed too quickly in theaters. And that's when small communities began forming online. Groups of people analyzing the movie shot by shot, not looking for hidden messages, just trying to understand Kubrick's choices. Why certain symbols appeared repeatedly in the background. Why the camera moved so slowly during the mansion sequence. Why certain faces seemed deliberately hidden by shadows. Most of these discussions stayed small, quiet corners of early internet forums, but sometimes someone would notice something unusual. A symbol on the wall, a pattern in the robes, or a detail that looked strangely familiar. One university professor even built an entire film studies course around the movie. The class explored historical secret societies and how their imagery resembled the film's ritual scene. Students later said the lectures were fascinating, but halfway through the semester, the course stopped. The professor suddenly took leave. The class was never offered again. no explanation was given. Individually, events like that don't seem important. People change plans, courses end, online accounts disappear. But when you place them next to each other, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Around the same time, people who had worked on the film occasionally mentioned strange experiences during production. Nothing dramatic, just uncomfortable moments. Actors describing a strange tension during the ritual scene. Extras who behaved as if they were familiar with the ceremony before cameras rolled. Crew members who noticed Kubrick becoming more cautious as the project continued. Installing additional security systems at home, avoiding certain conversations on the phone, and sometimes telling people he believed someone was watching the production closely. In the final weeks before his death, Kubrick reportedly met with a journalist researching secret societies. The meeting was private, off the record. According to the journalist, Kubrick seemed energized, focused, like someone who had just finished solving a difficult puzzle. He spoke about rituals among powerful circles, ceremonies hidden behind layers of wealth and privacy, and he hinted that his upcoming film might contain traces of that world. Not directly, but enough that people paying attention might start asking questions. 1 week later, Kubrick delivered the final cut of Eyes Wide Shut. 6 days after that, he was gone. The official explanation was simple: a natural medical event during sleep. But people who knew him noticed something strange. Kubrick had just completed the project he had worked on for years, and according to several crew members, he seemed relieved, like someone who had finally finished something important. The film premiered months later. Most critics called it slow, confusing, anticlimactic. Many viewers left theaters disappointed, and maybe that reaction helped bury the bigger mystery. Because if the audience believed the film was simply a strange drama, no one would ask why certain scenes had disappeared. No one would question why the original version was never shown again. But I remember that night in the projection booth. I remember the version Kubrick showed us. And I remember something else. Something almost no one talks about. Because near the end of that 4-hour cut, Kubrick included something that didn't look like part of a movie at all. It looked more like documentation. For years after Eyes Wide Shut was released, people assumed the mystery ended with Kubrick's death. The film was finished. The director was gone. Case closed. But the strange part of this story didn't end in 1999. In many ways, that's when it actually began. In the early 2000s, people connected to the film started speaking about something unusual. Not publicly, quietly. Conversations between crew members, small remarks in interviews, fragments of stories that never quite became headlines. Several people mentioned that Kubrick had collected large amounts of research while making the film. Photographs, audio recordings, documents, all of it stored privately during production. But after his death, most of that material was never seen again, and some of it may have disappeared before anyone could examine it. Kubrick was known for documenting everything, every stage of production, every version of a scene, boxes of notes, boxes of tapes, boxes of reference material. But according to people who worked around the project, some of the most sensitive material was never archived with the rest. It had been stored separately, in a private safe. A safe that was reportedly found open the morning Kubrick died. What was inside it has never been publicly confirmed. Years passed. Interest in Eyes Wide Shut faded. Then something strange happened in 2013. A storage facility in California containing Warner Brothers film archives was broken into. Security footage showed several individuals entering the building late at night. They ignored most of the valuable equipment, ignored other film archives, Instead, they went directly to boxes labeled with the production code for Eyes Wide Shut, and took only those. Nothing else. Whoever entered that archive knew exactly what they were looking for. The studio never released details about what was inside those boxes, and the people responsible were never identified. But investigators noted something unusual. The intruders appeared to know the exact location of the material, which suggested inside knowledge of the archive itself. Meanwhile, the people closest to the film have remained remarkably silent. Tom Cruise rarely discusses the project. Nicole Kidman almost never mentions it. And when they do, their answers are usually brief, carefully neutral, almost rehearsed. The film speaks for itself, nothing more, which raises a strange possibility. Maybe the most controversial part of Eyes Wide Shut wasn't removed from the film. Maybe it was removed from everything around it. The research, the documents, the footage Kubrick collected while preparing the story. Because Kubrick spent his entire career exploring hidden systems of power. Governments, institutions, secret structures operating behind public life. Eyes Wide Shut was the final film he completed, and according to several people who worked with him, it was the one he cared about the most, the one he guarded the most carefully, almost as if he believed it contained something important. Some truths are not hidden. They're simply placed in front of us, knowing we won't recognize them.